Hi everyone, my name is Utsa. I'm a third year DPhil candidate in history at Oxford. Before coming to Oxford, I studied in India at St. Stephen's College, New Delhi for my undergraduate course in English. But since 2021, I've been at Oxford, first completing my MPhil in 23, and I'm doing my DPhil since then. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and also to the OCHS for being an important pillar of support in my Oxford life, both as an academic home and a spiritual oasis. I also want to thank two of my friends who gave me a lot of advice before coming here, who also spoke here before me, Amir Kadir Bhai and Charvi Maheshwari, so thanks to them as well. But a little bit of background as to why I'm even doing this. So as I started my undergrad, I had planned to study and stay in English, eventually becoming an academic in the study of literature and language. But towards the end of my undergraduate life, however, it seemed like everything changed. We were all at college when COVID-19 happened. We started getting scattered reports that a certain virus had broken out in China. And as the months wore on, there was a case in New Delhi. My mother called me from Calcutta and asked me to come home as soon as possible. I did not think much of it. We had a week-long break before coming in March, and I said to my mother that I would come home then. I did come home during the break with a small suitcase and with all my things back in Delhi and many friendships left behind. A lot of my friends stayed back in North Campus, but 2 days into my break, COVID arrived, full-fledged in India. The government ordered a lockdown, and it seemed like the world had turned upside down. I never went back to Delhi after that until 2 years later to collect my BA degree. Over the next 2 years, I stayed at home while wave after wave raged after me. I had to apply for my master's around this time, and my plan was in the first instance to study language and literature, but around this time I had started reading a lot of Bengali novels from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I was struck to find so many references to epidemic outbreaks in them. Chief among them was Tagore. He wrote on and on about diseases in so many of his writings. There was cholera in Gora from 1905, and there was the reference to the plague in Calcutta in his 1916 novel Chaturanga. In Sarat Chandra Chatterjee, disease and epidemics were all around, animating the background of his novels and short stories. Disease was the silent other in all these stories, coloring the suffering of so much that was going on. And I was struck by similarities across time. It was a very strange feeling to be connected to people in the past through epidemics. But they were telling me something, and I think what they were telling me was that this pandemic, COVID-19, although the first of many of our lifetimes, was not new in the sense that just 2 generations ago, in our subcontinent, diseases and epidemics were much more rampant. I remembered my grandfather, for instance, had been affected by polio when he was a child. This was before the vaccine started, and he had memories of smallpox and cholera. In March 2020, during the second wave of the pandemic, my father fell ill. The fever followed the vaccine, so we didn't realize until much later that whether he was actually COVID struck or merely having a mild reaction to the vaccine. He thankfully managed to survive, but he was admitted to the hospital and on critical condition for a week. While he had survived, something in me had changed. I had seen so much cruelty during the pandemic, hoarding oxygen cylinders, hospitals overcharging, medical hoarding of medicines, for instance, and even ambulance and taxis increasing their fares to astronomical amounts. But I also saw endurance, optimism, determination. So citizen collectives were forming all around. Blood donation camps were being organized, often over WhatsApp, over messaging services, and perhaps one of the most interesting images for me that I came across during the COVID pandemic were these 2 images, and I'll just go to them in a while. So this was the first image, right? Does anyone know what this is? Any guesses? I can just do it. This is a worship of Corona Mata that was happening in Coimbatore. And that was the first image that was very interesting for me. And the second image was, this one, right? So this actually ended up becoming one of the most influential images of on the BBC website of 2021. This was taken in a medical college in Bangalore in 2021 to celebrate the 1 billion vaccine jabs of India. But in the description on the BBC website, it did not mention anything about what was also going on, which was, I felt, a reference to Durga. And there was a bigger story here. I think that's what made me really interested in studying epidemics historically. So I think that's one of the main motivations behind this talk. thinking through these two images and asking what indeed is going on here. And immediately articles did start coming out on Corona Devi, Corona Mata, and they were all talking a little bit about the history, but I felt there was a bigger history to be said here. What is the story that ties it all together? In this lecture, I will try to think about histories of disease and goddess worship during disease, and tie this story of Corona Mata to a longer story of disease traditions in the Indic imagination. I will focus on three goddesses: Sitala for smallpox, Olabibi, Olaichandi for cholera, and Kali worship during plague. And I'll bring it back to Corona Mata. And the question here is, what's the story behind Corona Mata? And so for that, we have to go back 2 centuries ago to Sitala, the goddess of smallpox. Right? This is Sitala. What you can see immediately is that she's on a donkey, and I'll get to the donkey in a bit. But Sitala is the goddess of smallpox, and the history of smallpox in British India, and specifically in Bengal, is much, much older. But throughout the 19th century, it's endemic and epidemic. It's all around, but it's also seasonal, and it's characterized by the worship of this goddess. What's interesting at the very first instance is that her name is Sitala. In those of you who know Bangla, or even from the Sanskrit root, Sitala means the cool one, the one who is actually cool, so from Sheet. Right? And there is a big debate about why this is her name. There are some stories which suggest that she's called this because she brings about fever, so the chill that fever brings. And there are other stories which suggest that maybe there are stories which suggest she was born from the ashes after a ritual, so that's why she's cold. But anyway, we don't want to go into too much into the debate about the name, but the name itself carries the symptom, right? And that's very interesting at the first instance. Sitala means the cool one, and she's cool for the symptoms of the disease which she brings. But it's also interesting that what follows the ritual of Sitala is that the body has to be prepared for her arrival. So before the worship of Sitala, there are all these rituals of certain foods that need to be eaten. The reason these foods need to be eaten is that it's believed that these foods cool the body, so the body is in this sense prepared for the arrival of the goddess. What follows after that is the ritual variolation. And variolation is the precursor to what we now know as vaccination, but it was this process through which you had Brahmins, or in other cases, some other castes, going from village to village before the epidemic would start, and they would induce immunity into children by rubbing a part of their body with the infected scab. This was to just induce immunity. What's interesting is that the animal that she is on top of, and her vahana is the donkey, and historically it was also believed that the milk of the donkey was a natural coolant for the skin, which was infected with smallpox. So her image really captures the disease itself. But there is a strange paradox at the heart of Sitala worship. So the religious historian Tony Stewart says that the ambivalence of Sitala worship lies in the fact that she is often prayed to for goodwill, for good things, so a better life, or fertility, a good crop. But as disease manifests, a proximity to her can also cause death. The complexity here is that while disease can be caused as a result of making her angry, disease can also be caused if you make her too happy. Right? So you don't want her to get too close. So there is a strange paradox there. And displeasure often happens, but often she also arrives because she's too happy with you. So you have to keep her at a respectful distance. What also complicates this devotion is that the belief that the death in the hands of Sitala is often seen as a form of divine release. So there's a famous phrase in Bangla we often say called Mayer Daya, or the grace of the goddess. And what's interesting is that to die at the hands of Sitala is also seen in some cases as a good thing, as a sort of salvation. It is for this reason that the scars left behind by smallpox are often not always seen as a bad thing, and the point at which the variolation really touches you is called the tika. And this is the same tika that we have on our heads, right? So I want to stop at this point for a second because I want us to consider what is being suggested here. Sitala, like the goddesses we will see after this, is both a giver of death, but she's also a giver of life. And the line between whether life is a blessing and death is a curse is blurred. This is significant and not at all counterintuitive, I think, because death caused by an epidemic, what is happening with these narratives is death caused by an epidemic is given meaning. This is significant, for death is not essentially negative as much as the meanings we ascribe to it. For those touched by Sitala and her cooling touch, death is propitious, even salvation. But from Sitala, I want to move a few decades into the future. While you have smallpox in Bengal, you also have cholera. And I don't want to go too much into the history of it, but cholera was there in British India even before the British colonization, but it's only in the 19th century that it starts becoming a problem. In the 1830s, you have the first pandemic which happens of cholera, and the home of cholera is seen as Bengal. Right? So it is not surprising that cholera worship also starts in Bengal. So there's a story to be told there about disease goddess and the virulence of the disease. But the story I want to talk about is a small song that I found in the that goes back to the 1880s. Tony Stewart and I wrote a paper on it, but it was a song for Olabibi, who is called the Muslim matron of cholera. But what's interesting about Olabibi is that she's worshipped by Hindus and Muslims alike. Often when she's worshipped by Hindus, she's called Olai Chandi. But her worship really goes beyond the sort of general Hindu-Muslim binary. I'll show you some pictures of Olabibi. So if you see here, this is a Hindu worship of Olabibi. So there is a murti of her. What you see below is that some of the differences that happen between Hindu and Muslim worship of Olabibi is in the rituals themselves, in whether there's a murti or not. But the essential goddess is the same. And what I also want to talk about is that if you see these two images, it's Olabibi and Jholabibi, and they're sisters, and Jhola comes from the word jhol, which is in Bangla, it's something liquid. And again, that's a reference to the cholera morbus, the symptoms of cholera itself. But she always holds her hand up in the Varabhaya Mudra. I'll come back to the Varabhaya Mudra at the end. But again, you have some of the symptoms of the disease kind of in the body of the goddess itself. And so you can trace what's really happening, what she stands for. But in the poem that I worked on, what was interesting was there were so many things that were shared with Sitala. In the poem from the 1880s, Olabibi arrives in the Meen Rajya, the kingdom of fishes. It's not mentioned as Bengal, but it's probably Bengal. And she descends as cholera on the people. What's interesting is that it says that it's not only people who are affected, it's also animals. So everyone is suffering from cholera, but the reason she is giving for arriving is because she is accusing the Hindu king of the area of praying too much to Sitala and not to her. So there's a competition between Sitala and Olabibi. What seems to me is that what this poem is talking about is this historical juncture where cholera is suddenly becoming more powerful than smallpox. So it's really an epidemiological battle that's being refracted through this beautiful poem of two goddesses. The poem ends with the king saying that I'm really sorry, I prayed to Sitala more than you, I shouldn't have done that, you are better than Sitala. Why? Because you kill quicker than smallpox kill. And according to the Shastras, you are the better disease, death in your hands is better. So again, Sitala's imagery is now being pushed onto Olabibi. But what was interesting is that she arrives and scolds the king in the form of a fly. So the word is makhi vesha. So she arrives in the form of a fly. And again, what's happening here is that she is the giver. She also takes cholera away, so she brings life back into the kingdom, but she also brought death. But the difference between the two is that she arrives in the form of the flea, and the flea at this period is seen as associated with cholera. So again, you have this divine goddess refracted through the symptom or the associated animals of the disease. The point here is that the same story seems to be coming back. The giver of death is also the giver of life. I want to move a little bit more into the future, into a longer story of plague now. So, and I'll talk a bit about Kali, but I'll also speak about the plague. So, from cholera in the 1880s, we now move into the late 19th century and plague. So, in 1894, we have the beginnings of the third global plague pandemic. The third global plague pandemic begins in, again, South China. And it reaches Bombay in 1896. Bombay becomes the secondary epicenter, and it's from Bombay that major ports of the world are affected. It also affects other cities in British India. So Bangalore is affected, Calcutta is affected, large parts of Punjab are affected. In fact, in Punjab, it's interesting because Punjab was one of the few places where plague is affecting even the rural population. But I want to focus on plague in Calcutta for a bit. It's interesting that Calcutta is not there mentioned on this map, but Calcutta was also affected by the plague. And the plague is an interesting pandemic because it's seen as the first instance, genuinely the first instance, where you have active vaccine rollout as a pandemic is happening. Before this, vaccine technologies were developing, but there was not a chance to try them out as a pandemic was happening. The plague is the first moment where the active plague vaccine is made as the disease is raging. But a lot of other things are also happening. And what's the plague? Essentially, there are three varieties of it. It can be bubonic. Yeah.
Sorry, can you give us a time reference to what you're talking about? I probably missed it.
Sorry, this is a map. This is a map of the plague. It's 1890, so late 19th century. It's starting in 1894, and by 1898, Calcutta is infected, right? But what's the plague really? It's a fever, and it can be bubonic. So in bubonic, you have the lymph nodes swelling up, and eventually you succumb to that. But the death rate is kind of 60%, 70%. The worst variety of it is the pneumonic variety, where you start spitting blood, or you can have a kind of septicemic variety. But in all cases, the plague is really connected to blood. It is connected. It's seen as a disease of the blood. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of goddesses and plague. So on the 27th of June, 1899, a certain lady correspondent, we don't know her name, wrote an article on her experience of a riot that took place against the plague and plague measures in Calcutta. The article, which was published in the Scottish newspaper, the Dundee Advertiser, it recalled a day in early May, just about a year ago, so this would be May 1898, she's writing in 1899. She talks about a riot that had gripped the city of Calcutta. The account of the pandemic riot began with a reference to the unusual quiet in the streets, which reminded the author of various rumors that she had been hearing from her ayah about, and one of the stories that the ayah had told her was that there was a rumor going about in Calcutta that the viceroy of British India had visited a, quote, famous fakir in the Himalayas, and the viceroy had asked the fakir whether it was true that British rule would soon come to an end. The fakir had told the viceroy that it was true, British rule would come to an end, and he was informed by the fakir that the only way that the British would be saved from the end of British rule was an appeasement of the gods by a great human sacrifice. Since the government had already by this point abolished sati and the murder of female children, it was rumored that the British would now plan to propitiate the bloodthirsty gods without open murder. What would they do? The rumor was they would import the plague from China, inoculate the people with a plague vaccine. A similar rumor of a viceroy meeting a yogi in the Himalayas was to save British India from collapsing is cited in a report by J. Neil Cook, who was the health inspector of Calcutta. This is something that I found during my master's work. In Cook's report, he does mention who this goddess is. He doesn't say it's to the bloodthirsty gods. It says that a yogi had made a compact with the viceroy to sacrifice 2 lakh lives to the goddess Kali, which would be done. How would the lives be sacrificed to Kali? It was suspected that it would be done by distributing white powders, black pills, and by administering lethal vaccines. But a small caveat must be inserted here. The particularity and perhaps even the peculiarity of this rumor in Calcutta is the fact that it was Kali who was being invoked. Kali, the mother goddess, was heavily becoming influential in Eastern India at this point, and she had been undergoing a resurgence in the middle of the 18th and 19th century in the region, and leading to the rise in the cult of Shaktism, and also, as you see in this period, in the rise of the Ramakrishna mission. So this is what's happening in 1899. But 7 months, so the first image that you have is Kali as pandemic, and she's bringing the disease. She is the disease. But 7 months later, so this is the first image, Kali as the deity of, she is the plague. But 7 months later, another imagination of the plague pandemic comes up. And this time, Kali is connected to the vaccine. This time, in an anonymous article published in a magazine called Janmabhoomi, it was a leading nationalist magazine. It would write against the British government. An article came out in August of 1900. Here, the author and the anonymous author argued that it was called Mahamari as Mahakali, and the author said that references to Mahamari were present in the Puranas as well as the Vedas, and that the Mahamari itself was Mahakali, great Kali of the Puranas. The author argued, depending on the epoch, she, Kali, was either the creator, so she was Srishtikarini, or the one who sustained, Palanakarini, or in her Tamarupa, dark form, she was the destroyer, Nashkarini. And when she was Nashkarini, she took the form of the Mahamari. This implied a cosmological system where everything was a manifestation of the goddess, and that death and destruction was not an end, but another form, a return, a reconsuming of everything by the goddess who had produced it in the first place. The article also argued that according to the Devi Bhagavatam, another ancient Hindu text, Kali had been created by the god Brahma. This is in the Devi Bhagavatam version. Kali had been created by Brahma, and that she would be given the task of cleaning the world of sin during the Kali Yuga, in the form of the Mahamari. Interestingly, sorry, I'll just go to this. So this was the article, Mahamari Mahakali. So it's in Bangla, but Mahamari Mahakali. But interestingly, the article ended with the following assertion. The author says, I almost forgot to mention something. The Markandeya Puran, which talks about Kali as Mahamari, also mentions Rakta Bij. Rakta Bij is the Asura who was born from blood, Rakta, and that is why he was called Rakta Bij. The author says the plague's Bij, the seed, germ, is also born in the blood, and is more terrifying than any Asura. Therefore, the Rakta Bij of the plague and the Rakta Bij of the Markandeya Puran are one and the same. The one who had killed that Rakta Bij in the past, which was Kali, and I'll get to that story in a bit. The author says the one who has killed that Rakta Bij in the past has been reborn in the Kali Yuga as a vaccine in Hafkin's lab. So who is Hafkin? Hafkin is the man who makes the plague vaccine, right? But what we do have here then is two contradictory narratives. We have Kali as vaccine, and we have Kali as pandemic. But the story being referred to here is this mythological slaying of Rakta Bij. What happens in the story is Rakta Bij is essentially indestructible because every time they attempt to cut him, every drop of his blood spawns more demons. So these are all the demons that are spawning. The only way he can be defeated is when the Devi splits herself in two, and as Kali, she drinks all the blood and then destroys Rakta Bij. So the only way she can destroy Rakta Bij is by becoming Rakta Bij. And it's this sort of complexity that's being explored here. So we have two contradictory but complementary narratives about Kali arising during the plague. On the first level, the rumor of 1898 was suggesting that the plague in Calcutta was a Mahayagna, a ritual sacrifice for Kali. However, by 7 months later, the narrative seems to have changed. And this is also the point the vaccines the rollout has started. The narrative seems to have changed, and it seems to have altered. While in the beginning, the article claims that the plague was the Mahamari form of Mahakali, it ends by suggesting that Kali is also reborn as a vaccine in Hafkin's lab. The apparent paradox, that is Kali as pandemic and Kali as vaccine, can be answered at one level by understanding the complex philosophical underpinnings of Kali worship itself, which sees the goddess Kali as both a locus of hope and despair. Kali is chaos, but also deliverance from that very chaos. And if you think, a lot of Shama Sangeet on Kali is also about how she's the cause of all the problems, but she's also the salvation from it. But the mythological tale being alluded to was interesting. In the mythological tale of Rakta Bij, I'll just go over it again. Rakta Bij was basically indestructible because every drop of blood that dropped from his body spawned more Rakta Bijas. The goddess destroyed this Asura by consuming every drop of blood that sprang from him. In other words, she could only defeat the demon by becoming the demon, or by consuming all of the demons. Similarly, the Mahamariya form of Mahakali could only be defeated, it seemed to be suggesting, by Mahakali herself. The article was attempting to explain the vaccine in mythological terms. Kali became both the cause of the problem, chaos, but also its cure, both punishment and deliverance. The weakened microbe injected into the bloodstream that would develop immunity and kill off the actual disease. The two faces of Kali as pandemic and vaccine are also in many ways the two faces we have seen in our last two goddesses. And so this goddess now walks across time. I just want to stop here and go back to Corona Mata. It seems to me that all these forms are speaking to Corona Mata. She is a continuation of this story, changed in one form but continuing in others. And all of this begs the question, can we invent new goddesses? The historical record seems to suggest that we can. But the question is, what will a future pandemic goddess look like? I mean, after going through the records, my guess is that there will be something that will be different, but also something that will not. What will be different, my guess is that she will take the symptomatic form of new diseases, that will be the changing bit, while maintaining the essential core of the ambivalent relationship our traditions share with the mother goddess. In other words, there will most likely be a new goddess if and when there's another epidemic. She will be different in some of her features, in the way she embodies symptoms. So think of how Kali as vaccine drinks the blood demon because the plague is seen as a blood disease. Think of how Sitala, the cool one, is giver of life and giver of death, but she embodies many of the symptoms of smallpox. Think also of Olabibi as the flea. So there is a kind of symptomatic congruence there. But in all these stories, they're essentially the mother, an angry form which also nurtures. But this shape-shifting, static mother tells us something else. As the giver of both life and death, she embodies the way we make sense of suffering, about the way in which suffering is given meaning, even positive meaning, the way in which communities endure and even celebrate times of crisis as markers of eventual salvation. And I think there's something complicated but also very beautiful in this. I want to come to a close by talking about an anecdote. So this is something that Shaunaka ji and I had worked on in 2022, which was on thinking of COVID and Hindu responses. We're also talking about how rituals changed on Zoom. So the Zoom you have here is the software Zoom. But the anecdote I want to talk about is in 2022, around the time COVID was coming to an end, I visited Bangalore to visit family. Before visiting Bangalore, I had come across this article, a series of articles actually online, about certain plague temples in Bangalore. These are two images of certain temples in plague from Bangalore. I think these are from TripAdvisor, so these are not taken by me. I came across a few plague Amma temples. I had read about these temples online. Some articles suggested that these were small local temples set up during the plague in Bangalore in 1890s. So if you recall, plague also came in Bangalore in 1898, around that time. And on a tour of Bangalore with my cousin, we visited one of these temples. It was a beautiful temple. I will show you the murti inside in a bit. It was a beautiful temple, and it was also a beautiful afternoon. The temple sat under a large tree. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the temple was unpeopled. It was a weekday. So the only one inside the temple was a Brahmin priest who was sitting quite quietly, and he didn't look like he wanted to be. He didn't look like he was expecting too many people. We went inside. The priest inside could not speak Hindi or English, and it was at that moment that my cousin, who had lived in Bangalore his whole life, decided to announce to me that he had forgotten Kannada. And he said it had something to do with becoming an engineer and speaking to everyone in his office in English, but I didn't believe him. But inside the temple was a murti of a goddess, was a murti of a goddess. Right? She looked a lot like many goddesses I had seen, in Bangalore, but also otherwise, even sharing similarities with many Murugan murtis, whose pictures were all around me. After a long 10 minutes of broken conversation, I managed to explain to the priest that I was interested in the plague. And he understood that word. He told me that this temple was actually around 60 years old. This was strange, because I thought it would go back to the late 19th century. But he said, no, this temple is 60 years old. And he said sometime in the 60s, there had been an outbreak of plague in this very vicinity. He motioned his hands to show me symptoms. Rakta, he said, Rakta. Motioning, a regurgitating motion. Blood vomit? I asked, and he shook his head, as if to say yes. I searched online, and it is true. In the 1960s, there were localized outbreaks of plague in certain neighborhoods of Bangalore. And what this man was telling me then was that this temple came up because of that localized outbreak. I asked him who the Murti was. That's Plague Amma, he said. That's Plague Amma. Did more people come into your temple because of COVID? I asked him, and he shook his head as if to say, obviously. He was excited and smiling, and he gave us, my cousin and I, some bananas and his business card. You can call me and ask me more, he was saying. We walked out and saw another Murti. But also, the one thing I want to mention here is that after I went back home that day with my cousin, my aunt was very happy with me, and she finally believed that I had turned her son to religion. Didn't happen, but yeah, my cousin also felt very spiritual that day. But anyway, after we saw that Murti of Plague Amma inside, we walked out and we saw another Murti. Right there. We walked out and there was another Murti, a goddess sitting on the roof of the temple. The sun fell on her face and she held up her hand in a Varabhaya mudra, like Olabibi, like Sitala, like Kali. Who is that? I asked the priest. Who's that? That is the Amma, he said, the actual form. The one in, so I said, what's really going on? He said, the one inside is who she becomes when she is plague. He said it so simply, so effortlessly. Of course forms change. As if he was saying, yes, she takes on a plague form, but that is housed within her true form, which is life-affirming. There she was, giver of life, giver of death. I think of that figure sitting serenely at a height, her face lit by the midday sun. I think of her silence, the silence in her stare, the evenness of her gaze, the way she looks through time and across the horizon. I think of her other forms. She's mercurial as smallpox, angry and hurt as cholera, caring and furious as plague. She is suffering and care manifest, the way life is both cruel and kind, and the way in which epidemics bring out the best and worst in us. But I also think of the ways in which mythologies often couch truths in them, how history remains in every little thing, how the past continues in little acts as well as grand ones. I think I'll just stop there. It's a little short, but we can have a longer discussion. And that's the story. That's the history behind this image, I think. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So that was a very fascinating talk, and can we have another round of applause, please, for Utsa? Let's start by opening up the floor to some questions. Any questions? No questions? So this narrative of giver of death and giver of life, and this image that you are showing now, has it sort of taken form of a deity yet, or it's early days for the corona deity to come about?
I think part of me thought when corona Mata worship was happening, I thought very selfishly that the worship would continue. That's a horrible thing to want, but I was interested in seeing whether the worship would continue. As far as I understand, I don't think it's continued, but what was interesting was the image that I showed you at the beginning of the Corona Mata worship. In Coimbatore, there's Corona Mata worship, but the Corona Mata Murti is within a bigger Plague Amma temple. So my sense is that these temples have probably gone back to worshipping the Amma itself. But it could be also because of the way in which we also don't talk about COVID as much anymore, right? Part of me thinks that this was like an emergency goddess that came up, and she took up COVID form, and it's gone back to Amma worship now. One thing I didn't mention here is that while researching for this talk, I found out there was an HIV Amma as well in the 90s. But again, I think one of the reasons we don't talk about it as much also is because HIV is not as big a problem anymore. But the Amma thing remains. So I think COVID Mata worship is not as intense, but also that's also because of the way in which we just don't talk about COVID. It's not a crisis anymore. I think that's one of the reasons it's not as entrenched.
Okay, so a follow-up question would be, if we take some of the earlier goddesses, if I can phrase it that way, Sitala, Mata, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, they were sort of worshipped. Even I remember as a Gujarati that it was done. And when I had smallpox, and then we had to go and worship the goddess, I remember my mom taking me, etc. But these newer ones, they seem to be more southern and eastern goddesses. Why is that they are not spread sort of westwards or northwards?
So newer as in you mean?
I mean, I'm talking about the goddesses you referenced here.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sitala worship is much more pan-India.
Yes.
Olabibi, I think one of the reasons being that cholera was a much bigger problem in the Delta region.
Right.
But Kali worship, so I did find some mention of plague as Kali in Bombay. So, and that's also to do with the way in which the plague was understood. Like the plague was seen as a collapse of law and order as well. Like they brought in this horrible epidemic diseases law. And if you're from Bombay, people still talk about it. So I think it's got to do with the disease itself and what the sort of epidemiological geographical range of the disease was. But Corona Mata is not, I think, localized. It's more in the south. I think that's got to do with the power of the Mata imagery itself. But there was Corona Devi worship in Uttarakhand as well.
Okay.
So there is, what was interesting is that I think, so smallpox has been eradicated, right? But the Sitala mandirs are still there. And I remember asking, there's a Sitala mandir nearby where I stay, and I remember asking a priest there that who do they worship? And he said, no, but there are other diseases. Like people come in with that. So I think there's, so part of the answer to your question would be like, I think the diseases themselves were much bigger problems. But yeah, so cholera was a much bigger problem in the east and parts of the south at this point, at least.
Okay, so the plague we had in the late 19th century, how long did that last?
So
roughly?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say when it ended because, I mean, I think so for Bombay, it starts in 1896, it stops being like a complete problem of law and order by 1907, 1908. But by that point, it started in Punjab. So I think for the whole thing to end and become like controllable endemic is 1920s. But a lot of plague discussion is kind of shut down post 1910-15 because of the World War and influenza.
Okay.
But yes, I think the numbers continue till the 1930s and 40s, but it stops being a complete problem by 1910.
Okay.
So like for 15 years of the disease.
Okay. I think you very speedily went through something about the guy who
made the vaccine.
Who made the vaccine, and there was some reference to Kali Mata or something. Yes. Can you sort of elaborate a little bit on that, because didn't quite get it?
Yeah. So what's happening is, as I said, the plague in British India is the first moment you have an active epidemic and an active vaccine rollout. The person the British government goes to make that vaccine is a man called Waldemar Haffkine. He's Ukrainian. Yeah, he's French-Ukrainian. And when he's approached to make the plague vaccine, he had already spent 2 years in Calcutta trying to develop a cholera vaccine. But the British government comes up to him and says, stop your operations, start making a plague vaccine. This is also a period where there's a lot of competition between imperial powers, but also who is making the lead in bacteriological technology. So part of commissioning the vaccines, there's also a vaccine race going on. So it's interesting that this is a very old problem, like who gets to make the vaccine first. Yeah. So Haffkine is commissioned by the British government to make the vaccine. He sets up his lab in Parel, in Bombay, and which is why you still have the Serum Institute. So there's a whole history to why Bombay is the sort of serum capital of India. Haffkine's lab is there, and he doesn't get a lot of funding initially, but he also faces a lot of bias because he's a Jew, and he's also French and Ukrainian. So there's a whole background to him and the problems he faces. But by 1898, he comes up with the vaccine. And he tries it on himself, and it's somewhat, I think at that point, a 50-60% success rate. There are others who are also developing, but he's the one the government goes with. Like, he's the one the government invests in. But the vaccine is really made in Bombay, and so when people in Calcutta are talking about the vaccine, they're saying that it's made by this guy who made a cholera vaccine in the past, which didn't work as well. So there's a whole story there about like who's making the vaccine and how does that affect how we see the vaccine. So that's the Hafkin story. What they're saying about Kali is that Kali has been if the vaccine is what's saving us, then maybe it's Kali reborn. Maybe the vaccine is actually an avatar. The word they use is avatirna. Okay. The word they use, and I couldn't really explain that much in the talk, but in the Bangla they say that in the one who killed Raktabij in the Satya Yuga has been reborn in the Kali Yuga, avatirna as a vaccine. So what's happening there is they're trying to explain, they're not saying vaccines are not good. They're saying, yes, take the vaccine, but know what it is. It's actually a goddess, reborn in a lab. And which lab? The lab that the government is funding. So two things are happening. So they're not anti-science, but they're also saying that they're mythologizing the science, essentially. So that's
okay.
a story that's, I think,
okay. Thank you. So can we attribute the corona to, AstraZeneca Devi and Moderna and Pfizer Devi, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible because what they're saying, they're not saying that the Devi is against biotech. They're just saying that, yes, the people making the vaccine, yeah, they made the vaccine, but the vaccine is actually an avatar. She's come back as a vaccine. So, yeah, so it's not an AstraZeneca problem. And AstraZeneca can also make, AstraZeneca is just the medium, is I think what they're saying. So Hafkin is the medium through which the goddess is coming back to our life.
Right, okay.
So, yeah, Moderna, Devi.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, just one question here, please.
Lovely talk. Yeah. But I have a different take on listening to what you said. And we've actually looked at two being the same, the giver of death and taker of death, right? But then we've dwelled on the actual medication for it. Okay, so now let me take you back a bit. There are people who never took the medicine. Right? So that's one.
Yeah.
Two, it's a British thing that you need a medication to serve this. So let me take you a step back further. You mentioned in the cholera epidemic, people were dying, and so were animals were dying. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Right. So let's now look at this corona pandemic. Show me a place on earth where animals died, because there was no real animals dead. Birds were, sea life. Everything was untouched, right? Okay, bar the human being.
Yeah.
And when it came to the human being, it wasn't just the Hindus or the Chinese or any other particular thing. Every human on earth, and irrespective of what they were or what part of the world they were affected by the coronavirus. So then, why do we take the credit as her being the goddess of this, and affecting other religions, other things? So my take is different on what you've just said. It contradicts what you're saying.
No, so with Olabibi, it's interesting because the poem that I was looking at, there's a poem that's published in 1882, 1878, around that time, and it's a jagran for her, and it's supposed to be sung. And in the jagran, what happens is it says Olabibi enters Pravesha, she enters the Meen Rajya, and she's affecting everybody, right? So birds are also exhibiting symptoms, jackals are crying, people are dying. So there is a sense here that is, we talk a lot now in academic circles about one health models, like animal health is important for human health. I think there's something similar to that going on here, but it also, I think, tells us about how cholera was even viewed as not just a human problem, but as a collapse of every kind of order. You have this in older Even in even in Charaka and Shushruta, one of the symptoms that an epidemic is coming is animals start acting differently. In Agnivesha is telling Charaka, how do you know the pandemic is coming? He says, the birds are flying in a different direction, the jackals are crying. So there is this, I think it's also to do with the literary form, to show chaos, that's showing it's not just a human problem. But it's also true that with plague, animals also keep coming back, because if you know about how the plague works, is that it's a flea that is infected with the virus, the flea bites the rat, and then when the rat dies, the flea bites the human. This connection of different animals is not really discussed scientifically until formally 1905, but what they see throughout the plague is scores and scores of animals dying. You see, and by animals, majorly rats dying, right? And there's an astrologer I found who's writing about the plague in this time, and he's talking about why plague is happening so much in Bombay and not so much in Calcutta. And he says, of course it's happening in Bombay because it's the city of Ganesh, and who is Ganesh's Vahan? It's the rat, right? So the animal keeps coming back. In smallpox, I don't know as much, but I think there is a sense here that the goddess rules over all and she affects everyone, and an epidemic is essentially not just seen as a human problem, it's seen as it's a complete problem of all species. And that's interesting to think about in COVID, because you're right, I mean, there's a sense in which COVID was a uniquely human problem, but the funny thing is COVID has raised more discussions now on sort of zoonosis, animal health, like when do we know if an animal disease spills onto human diseases, like think of avian influenza, swine flu, MERS. There was whole debates during early 2000s in MERS where they suspected camels of carrying MERS. So I think we're seeing I would say we're going back to these models of One Health, and I think Hinduism does mention One Health in a sense that it's not just a human problem, it's an animal problem as well. But yeah, it's a very important point. It's not just us.
Thank you. Hold on.
Yeah. Yeah, it starts. Yeah, it's interesting because the rat as the carrier of the plague as a rat disease is a retrospective construction that happens in the 19th century, because there's a historian I work with who's really, he's coming out with this book called How the Plague Got Rats. Like, how did rats get connected? Because for the longest time, rats were seen as like the most hardy animals. Like, everything might die, rats won't die. But what plague is doing is that it's changing that relationship. What you have is you have this famous image, which now is very common, like in Albert Camus and all of this, the image of this rat, which is like staggering and it's dehydrated and then it falls into the water. That's the image that keeps coming back. But this image only becomes common in the 19th century during this plague. Because what they're seeing is scores and scores of dead rats before an epidemic happens. So the epidemiological process of the plague is that an epizootic precedes an epidemic. And much more rats die than humans. It's only when the rat has died and rats have either migrated somewhere else or the host population has died or gained immunity, that's when they affect the human. So the problem of the plague was that the rats are dying, but that's not causing it. So that's why it takes a while to develop, because killing the rat is then clearly not enough, because the rat is not going and biting. The rat is actually the victim of the problem, and it's actually a sentinel. The rat is the symptom that something bad's going to happen. But the way the plague works is that the virus, the Yersinia pestis virus, it grows in the belly of the flea. Then the flea, it's a blood-sucking flea, it bites the rat, and then it jumps from the body of the rat to another rat. And then once the host population of rats have all died out, or they've migrated somewhere else, then they bite the human. Or if you're living in a house where you have rat-infested houses, then if there are enough dead rats, then the fleas will get hungry and bite you. So that's why when they scale this in the early 20th century, they're trying to make ratios of how many rats to how many humans. They're seeing much more rats are dying than humans. So actually, there's a sense that comes up here that the rat is not really causing it. It's the victim of this problem.
But in England, that's not what.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking.
Yeah.
I don't think they've accepted it.
No, but it's easy to blame the rat because it's close to dirt all the time. but the rat also becomes this by this period this blame figure for everything. Like they live in the sewers. They refuse to die. Of course, they're causing the problem because but actually, it's the rat doesn't really cause the plague. It signals that the plague is going to happen because you see all these dead animals on the street and you start realizing, okay, like it's going to affect us now.
Any more questions? Okay, so can we have another round of applause for a very fascinating talk? Thank you. Okay, we are going to wrap up, and we have some prasad here, so please help yourselves. And I don't think we have any announcements to make. Oh, we have one.
Just one.
Can we make it brief
Yeah.
so we can drop the speaker off?
Okay, very briefly, normally I'd ask you how the OCHS benefits you and why do you actually study or came to study with them.
Yeah.
Please, the center itself. Thank you.
I think it's interesting because my journey with the OCHS didn't really begin academically. I had just come into Oxford in 2021. It was very cold, and I was reading bits of the Upanishads, and I found someone online, Jessica Fraser from the OCHS, who works on that, and I dropped her an email and said, "Can I speak about Hinduism with you?" And she said, "Yes, come to one of our Wednesday lunches." The easy answer is I never left after that. But and I've been told that I've become furniture. But the interesting connection there is that it was a place for me to actually, I was not really studying faith when I started going there. I was actually doing my own research. But by attending the events, and I think the way I've benefited is that it's this process of osmosis where I've just sort of absorbed, and I've realized how much faith is everywhere, even in the historical record. And so it's benefited me academically because it's opened up areas of my research that I would not have explored otherwise because I'm not in the theology department. But it also helped me personally because it's only after I got into OCHS that I realized like my own history. It's a funny story because I had to go to Oxford to realize which part of India I was actually from and what were my traditions. But it's only after I went to the OCHS that I realized there were sampradayas, like how is a Shakta different from a Shaiva, is different from a Vaishnava, like who is a Gaudiya Vaishnava. And only after I found that, I went back home and I dug up all these family documents, and it helped me find out who I was, where I come from, what stories do my parents have. Now I've become a pain for them because I go and tell them all these Hindu things and they're just like, we don't know what you're asking, it's too much. But yeah, I think that's how it's helped me. And it's always, it's home for me, so yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll wrap it up there because we are keen to finish off. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.